Hi, I'm Dr. Selena Fisk, and welcome to this episode of Make Data Talk. In this podcast, I help you turn your spreadsheets into stories in a way that is practical, accessible, and hopefully a whole lot more useful than your grade 9 maths textbook. I get asked a lot of questions that I guess are related to or would sit under the umbrella of the ethical use of data. And so this episode today is going to cover, I guess, a few of the challenges we have and I guess the role we play in really ensuring that we're using data in the right ways. I guess the first thing that it always comes up in these conversations is the way that data can be manipulated to tell a story that we want it to tell. And that's absolutely a factor. And as data storytellers, we need to make sure that we're not manipulating the data and we are being more honest in our reporting rather than, just telling people what we think that they want to hear or cherry picking the information that kind of suits our agenda. Now, to be honest, if you're listening to this podcast, this is probably not going to be something that you're doing, hopefully, because it is a really dishonest practice. It's not an unconscious thing. It's often conscious. I've heard some horrendous examples of this over time, and I think the thing that is consistent about all of the stories I've heard about the misuse and misrepresentation of data is that your audience can see straight through it. People know when you're not telling them the truth. And, I think of an example that was shared with me a little while ago about an employee survey where the staff survey results were very poor. They gave some pretty scathing feedback back to the leadership team, and rightly so. They had a lot of concerns about what was going on in the organisation. And the executive leaders in the organisation got up in front of everybody, presented the data back to the team and to all the employees, and basically just focused on only the questions that had good results and good responses. They manipulated some of the metrics to suit them. So they changed, I guess, or reinterpreted, if you like, the way some of the responses had been given. So they kind of grossly categorized a range of responses into being largely positive responses when many of them were actually neutral. So that was one issue. But then they focused on the pieces that, I guess were more positive than others. So things like some of the, the structures and the things that were kind of almost out of their leadership control or weren't about them directly. They just focused on them. And what ended up happening was that the employees were sitting there listening to this this feedback and this summary, and they were just, from all reports, just absolutely furious. And their trust and belief in the leadership team just dropped significantly, even though they weren't happy already. The fact that they were watching these people get up in front of them and ignore all of those major issues and pretend like everything was rosy actually did more harm to them as leaders than anything. So we've got to be really clear about being honest and not cherry picking. It's not about us answering our own story. We need to lead into that discomfort of saying, look, these are some of the challenges we've got here, and we recognize them and we see them, and then these are the strategies that we're going to employ, or these are the things that we're going to do about it. At the end of the day, as I say, people can see straight through it. They know exactly what's going on. So there's actually no point. You're doing more harm to your reputation than good if you manipulate data and then present it back, particularly to the people who have actually shared it with you and given it to you in the first place. The second one, the second ethical consideration to think about is the importance of sharing the context. So this kind of almost goes into the same point as the last around. We don't want to cherry pick the data. But this goes further into saying we actually want to be able to provide a complete context around what was collected, how it was collected, who was involved. We've got to be able to talk about the why and the how, like why are some of these things happening and how do we think we're going to solve it, but also how have we actually collected the information. And part of that is also acknowledging things like limitations. Every data set's problematic. We know that, and no question or approach is ever going to be perfect. But acknowledging some of those limitations and challenges as a part of the context is a really key way to, I guess, increasing our ethical use of data. We also need to talk about anomalies. So if we've removed anomalies, so there's a mathematical formula for calculating anomalies, and in theory, there are some reporting mechanisms and some organizations that will remove anomalies to aid the story, I guess, rightly or wrongly. If you've done that, and there's a number of good reasons why we might choose to remove them, but we've absolutely got to name that. So if you would take it out, we can't ever, I guess, hide that from the audience or just leave it out of the storytelling. It's got to be mentioned somewhere just so people know that, that it's not the entire data set. We also need to talk about, in terms of the context, external factors that have influenced the results. So, an example that I use in I'm Not a Numbers Person is the example of swimwear sales. So, if you think about if you were tracking the sale of swimwear through spring and then summer, it'd be quite high, and then autumn and winter, and it would drop off. You think, in an extreme example, if you just looked at a line graph that showed the number of sales or the volume of sales over that time period, it would look pretty bad because it would go from being pretty good to reaching its peak in summer, and then it would decline over time and would look really poor. But obviously, we always include the conversation about the weather and the fact that, of course, we're going to be selling less swimsuits in winter than we are in summer. So it's just being able to bring in the context into the narrative that ensures that our storytelling, our data storytelling, is more ethical. The third piece that we need to think about in terms of, our ethical use of data is around protecting people's privacy and, you know, I guess keeping people and data sets anonymous where we need to. Um, Particularly when we're working with sensitive data, we've got to make sure that we're really protecting individual identities, and that's really got to be a non-negotiable in any of the ways that we use data. As you know, I've done a lot of work in schools, and I used to be a high school teacher. And I think about the examples of identifying students in a data set, publicly. So I worked in a school in the UK where every grade 9 student was ranked in the main corridor from top to bottom. That's not an ethical use of data to put it in a public space like that, where visitors to the school can see it, where anybody walking around can see it. It's year 9, so it's not high stakes. They've not protected the privacy or kept people anonymous at all. It was all names and everything. So, you think about when you're reporting back, like even in staff surveys, for example, you don't want to be naming specific teams, or we've got to think about, like, if there's only a really small group of people that represent a group, we've got to be super careful that people cannot be identified from that information. One of the things I do, so as many of you would know, I have a data diagnostic on my website, and people can get their own individual reports back to them. It's free. You can all go and have a look at it if you haven't done it already. But we then produce a report for organizations to give them a summary of everybody's self-reporting on their data literacy, visualization, and storytelling. And one of the key things we always say to people when we, promote it is we say, this is completely de-identified, and we never, ever, ever give names back to organizations for whom we write those reports, because, to be honest, for us, it would almost be kind of career, it would almost be career ending if people found out that we were doing something that we were saying we weren't doing. But it actually doesn't serve us in any way to name people and share that information back with the organization. So if you're truly asking people to do something that's anonymous, or you are telling them that it's de-identified, it's absolutely got to be. Again, trust plays such a key part in so much of this ethical use of data. And it's just a very quick way to erode trust if you do something that you have said you're not going to do. The other part is also when to not share that information. So there might be times that it's actually better for you to keep the information on the down low, or not share it kind of publicly or with other staff. So I guess it's just being sensitive and to the privacy and, I guess, personal experience of the people who are in the data set, who've trusted you enough to kind of share the data with you and to answer your survey or to be involved in the research questions or whatever it might be. But yeah, we've got to be really deliberate and selective about what we're choosing to share and when. The final one then is that the whole time we're trying to do this well and we're trying to tell ethical data stories and use data ethically, is that we've always got to be conscious of our biases. And I talk about this in another podcast episode. But we know that our biases can creep in during, the selection of data, the analysis that we're doing, the prioritizing of what's important and not important, and even when we're creating a narrative. So we've got a real duty to really question our assumptions. We've got to think about, what data do we have that disproves the hypothesis that we have? That's a really great way of starting to check some of those assumptions that we've got. And we also want to have diverse perspectives contributing to the conversation, because we're trying to avoid really, reinforcing stereotypes or systemic inequities. So by bringing other people in who are represented in the data set, or people who maybe are not represented in the data set, and asking them what they see, what they think, what the trends and insights are to them, that can start to challenge some of those biases. So, being aware of the different biases we have is one step, but actively, when we bring other brains in with us and involve them in the conversation and actively seek data that disproves our hypothesis, then we are definitely using data more ethically. So those 4 things, again, we want to be honest and not manipulate the data and just cherry pick the pieces that we need. We need to always share the context and that whole story to make sure that people have got a really well-rounded understanding of what's going on. We need to make sure we're always protecting people's privacy and keeping data anonymous when we need to. So we don't obviously want to have any data that we're sharing being able to be attributed to specific individuals. And then the final one is around biases. We want to challenge them. We want to, as much as we can, reduce the impact of them on our work. So thanks so much for joining us on this episode of Make Data Talk. I hope that those kind of 4 talking points today have given you some ideas and some thinking around how do we start to reduce some of those, concerns that we have, so that we can just do this better. As always, this is also available as a newsletter on LinkedIn, so feel free to subscribe and you'll get a weekly update dropped into your inbox. If this episode is useful to other people, as always, I really appreciate any likes and shares. Take care and look after yourself.